Good evening, and welcome to Sex on Six Legs. But before we talk about sex, I have to point something out, which is that people are actually more afraid of insects than they are of dying. And this is from a survey taken quite a long time ago, one of those things where you had to list what you were afraid of. And only public speaking and heights were more frightening than insects, although financial problems and deep water, presumably if you were immersed in the deep water, tied with insects at number 3. Public speaking is our biggest fear, which I always feel funny pointing out to people as I give a talk. Dying actually came in at number 6. And I don't really think that there's any reason to expect that things have changed. This is from a book published in 1973. And I actually think that if spiders had been included with insects, fear of the multi-legged in general would have easily topped the charts. I mean, people have really strong feelings about insects, and most of those feelings are negative. But see, at the same time, some of the greatest minds in science for centuries have drawn inspiration from studying the smallest minds on Earth. And naturalists have been fascinated by the lives of six-legged creatures because they seem both frighteningly alien and also kind of familiar. They take care of their young, fireflies and crickets flash and chirp for mates, ants construct very elaborate societies. And there's all these internal politics that happen in insects that, really would put most parliaments or congresses to shame. And so scientists still keep wanting to tell their stories, and people still keep wanting to hear about insects. Now, see, some of it is just the sheer magnitude of almost everything about insects. You've probably all heard that they're more numerous than any other animal. They make up about over 80% of all species. And estimates of the numbers of kinds of insects vary all over the place because new ones are being discovered all the time. But there are at least 1 million, possibly as many as 10 million different kinds of insects. And so to put that in perspective, this means that you could have an insect of the month calendar, and you would not need to reuse a species for over 80,000 years. And I think, that's kind of in the face, pandas and kittens, because insects can outdo you. And what that means is that insects, and this is part of why people are so interested in them, is that they give a lot of scope for evolution to act on. If you think about it, insects are like the ingredients for a menu in a vast natural restaurant. And you can come up with a lot of different recipes with insects than you could if, say, you were studying birds or mammals. And then, there is the sensationalism. It is really true that male honeybees' genitals explode after sex, and everyone is really interested in how mantises eat their mates and all kinds of exciting things like that. But I think one of the things that's most exciting about insects is that along with their kind of alien-seeming behavior, insects seem to do a lot of what people do. I mean, they mate with each other, they break up, they fight, and they do so with what looks exactly like love or animosity. I mean, dung beetles take care of their babies. They do almost everything human mothers do for them. They feed them, they clean them, they protect them. And ants keep aphid cattle that, it's essentially like they're herders. They move their herd from place to place. They milk the honeydew that the aphids produce. Bees convey the location of food using symbols. And unlike any other non-human animal, including any primate you can think of, some insects live in very sophisticated hierarchical societies with specialized tasks that are assigned to different individuals and that have an ability to make collective decisions that favor the common good. And so it's like they're mirroring most of our familiar behaviors, and you look at them and you think, well, they're just like us. But the thing is, they do all of those things in stunningly different ways from humans. And it's like they're getting to the same destinations without any of the same highway systems or modes of transport. So when we see a reflection of ourselves in insects, it's kind of eerily superficial, because what drives their behaviors is not what drives our own. So underneath the maternal care, the language, the complicated social system is basically a handful of nerve cells that are strung together in a few small clusters inside a really tiny body. So think about it. Insects don't have any of the brain parts that we associate with higher thinking. They don't have a cerebrum. They don't have the right and left hemispheres. They don't even have that so-called reptilian brain, the cerebellum. They don't have a pituitary gland. They don't have hormones like we do. And yet, a wasp with a body that's probably about the size of a little bean can dig a burrow or construct a nest, go off and find a prey item. This one has found a spider that's just the right size to feed her young, paralyze it so it's alive but can't move, bring it back to the burrow, remember where the burrow was and where she found the spider, and how many other prey items and any other spiders that she brought. And then she can go back and do it again until she's brought exactly enough spiders, but not too many and not too few, so that she doesn't waste any of her energy. And so that's what this wasp is doing here. Now, most of us, if I told you, like, okay, go out and find me a spider, you probably couldn't do it. And even if you could, you couldn't bring it back to a site the equivalent of, a whole province away. But these wasps are capable of tremendous cognitive tasks without having any of the cognitive abilities that we have. And so, how is that possible? Here's an ant tending some of those, these are scale insects, but it's the same thing. It's like she's keeping them like they're cattle. And so how can you get what looks like human reasoning, sometimes it even looks like human love, when you lack not only a human brain, but even the chemicals in the blood that drive human emotions? It's easy to imagine a fellow warm-blooded creature, like a dog or a bird, having motivations or feelings like your own. But what about when the entire nervous system of this wasp, which is attacking aphids, would, fit the entire nervous system? The brain and all the nerve cells would probably, fit inside of a poppy seed. And I think that for me, what insects do is bring home this kind of uneasy truth that you don't need a big brain to do big things. And that, in turn, makes us question how the mind and whatever else you want to call it, your spirit, your soul, your essence, are related to the brain. And I think it makes us question what it means to be human. So what does it mean to have complex behavior? If you have complex behavior, does that mean you're smart? Is the complexity of a honeybee nest with its beautiful economically constructed hexagons the same thing as an apartment building? We all have our prejudices, and I think that even scientists get very vertebrate-centric about understanding behavior. So people make a big fuss about certain animals. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of New Caledonian crows, which are relatives of magpies and the crows we have here. And they can construct a tool, and they can construct a tool out of a leaf and use it to poke a grub out of a branch. And people got very excited about that, and you can read about it in all the headlines about science. Or people get very excited because chimpanzees can use a stick to get termites from a hole in the ground. we say, oh, that's very important because making tools is something that only humans can do. But at the same time, natural selection and evolution can produce what looks exactly like intelligent thought or emotion, but is no more than just the relentless culling of minute variations, generation after generation, in genes for millions of years. And so what I like about insects, and some of what I want to share with you, is that I think insects make us question pretty much every assumption that we have about what makes humans human, because they kind of lay bare how evolution can work and that it doesn't always work in the same way. And so what I'm doing here is actually presenting you with little bits and pieces from a book that I wrote called Sex on Six Legs several years ago, and I want to try and bring out some of the highlights. And so this one I am going to read. I've been sort of summarizing. I am going to read to you, and it's from a section called "An Army of Savage Lace," because it's a little bit of a memory of some stuff from when I was younger. So when I was a child, I went through a phase in which I told people I wanted to be a myrmecologist when I grew up. And although I did indeed spend time watching the ants in our backyard, along with the other insects, I was probably driven more by being kind of smug about knowing that the word myrmecologist means someone who studies ants, than by actually any career motivation. And I actually don't study ants now, and so it didn't really work out. But be that as it may, so we had an assignment when I was in 3rd or 4th grade to read a book and report on it to the rest of the class. And I chose a book on ants. And I happily launched into a litany of their amazing behaviors. So I pointed out that ants made gardens of fungus that they harvested for food. They stored honeydew in their own massively swollen abdomens and fed it to the other workers droplet by droplet. Not only that, I cheerfully told my classmates, who were by that point probably unnerved if they were not just bored, but army ants could swarm through entire jungle villages, consuming every living thing they encountered by tearing it to pieces. Cows, pigs, chickens, and people all were subject to the advancing hordes with their bladed jaws. If one were caught unawares by the incoming troops, the only recourse was to set one's bedposts in saucers of kerosene, get under the covers, and then pray the ants didn't find a way to drop down onto the bed from the ceiling. Now, I was slightly hampered in my explanation of this dire state of affairs by my uncertainty of exactly what kerosene was at the time, because it was not a word with which I was familiar as a child. But I was sure that if I lived in an area frequented by army ants, I would be able to get some. Okay, so at this point, my teacher intervened. "Surely," she said, "you are exaggerating. Ants could not possibly be that destructive. Maybe they attacked the animals in an area, or, they got into a hut or something. But the scale of devastation and carnage that I was describing seemed a little bit much for such a tiny creature." I dug in my heels. And I was actually a very timid child. I was very, one of these people that paid a lot of attention to authority. So looking back on that, it was quite incredible that I decided that if I was going to stick up to my teacher, I was going to do it about ants. But I insisted that the book had said, and hence I unswervingly believed, that, that ants could tear apart a person in minutes. It wasn't just, like an occasional animal. It was a whole village. And I honestly don't remember how or if this disagreement was resolved, or if my grade on the book report was reduced because of my teacher's suspicion of exaggeration. But I still remain convinced that people do not fully appreciate the wonders of ants, perhaps because they refuse to believe the extraordinary things that ants and other insects can do. So here I'm just showing you, often when people hear me talking about people studying ants, they think, how can you possibly study ants because they're so tiny? And the answer is just very carefully. And so here's somebody studying ants, and what you can do is you hold them very gently, and then you can actually mark them with a brush so that you can give them individual colors, and so that they look like themselves, and you can tell one ant from another. And so there's lots of exciting details if anybody is interested in asking about them on how people manage to study ants and how interesting they are. But now I want to move to sort of more of the sex part of the evening. So really, usually people cheer when I say that, yeah. And I'm going to start by talking about an old movie that some of you may remember, which was called Bee Movie. Did anybody? I can sort of see. How many people saw Bee Movie? Do you remember it from a while back? Yeah, a fair number of you. So Jerry Seinfeld, you know, the comedian and actor, played a kind of slacker honeybee, sort of a lazy honeybee, who was yearning for a life beyond the tedium of the hive. And he portrayed, of course, you know, a worker. And his portrayal of that social insect as a male is as glaring in its inaccuracy as in its ubiquity. Now, I realize that, you know, nobody, including me, expects movies to be accurate in all their details, especially when they talk about science. But, you know, there are errors, and then there are errors. There is, you know, sort of a little bit of poetic license versus just flat-out incredible stupidity and ineptitude. And talking animal, you know, so people sometimes will say, when I start bringing this up, they will point out that, you know, you do realize that the bees in there were talking and that bees don't talk. And yes, I know that. But, you know, talking animals is one thing. But getting it wrong about the sex of honeybees, to me, is like portraying astronauts in a movie where you show that the sun revolves around the Earth. Or, you know, you'd have TV doctors who were saying, oh no, someone is anemic, they don't have enough lead in their blood, you know, instead of iron. I mean, it's really on a level of that kind of stupid. And it's also, it goes beyond, you know, sort of an aha thing about I'm an expert and they're not. Because the way I see it, there's at least two problems with having that kind of ignorance about the sex of social insects. The first is that if you don't really know anything about what sex most social insects are, then you get kind of a skewed vision of what the world is like and what its sex roles are like. And I think that vision can end up affecting the way we see males and females in people. And the second reason is that if you assume that everything in the insect world is the way it is in our own species, you miss out on some really cool stuff. Because in sex roles, as with a lot of things about insects, the truth is a lot more interesting than the things that we think are happening. Now, okay, so first thing is, so you all, I am sure, know that pretty much all the social insects, all the bees and wasps and ants that you're going to see when you're outside are all female. They're all female. All the ants that are going into your sugar bowl, all the wasps that are bothering you at a picnic, all the honeybees flitting from flower to flower, unless you keep bees, you are virtually certain to see only females. But for centuries, literally probably for thousands of years, people thought that instead bee colonies were male-dominated. And the phrase, there was a poem by a kind of obscure English poet named Charles Stewart Calverley, who wrote a bunch of books of poems. And so one example is one that contains these lines, "When his thighs with sweetness laden, from the meadow comes the bee." And even Benjamin Franklin, who was from colonial United States, fell into the stereotype. He wrote to a woman he was courting and said, contained lines from a poem that said, "Belinda, see from yonder flowers, the bee flies loaded to his cell. Can you perceive what he devours? Are they impaired in show or smell?" And so there were lots and lots of people in all these movies, including Bee Movie, that were following in a tradition that has been present actually since at least the ancient Arabs and Greeks. So they thought that there was a king bee or a bee father. In the case of the Arabs, they thought there was a bee father who was in charge of the hive, and the followers were males as well. And that was a little bit of a debate, but the Greeks, they could actually tell that there were different types of bees because they kept bees, they used honey. And so they looked at different types of bees. I should really make a drawing of this that hides the identification, but so you probably all do know this. So here's the regular Western honeybee, the one that pollinates all of our crops. And so this is a worker, and she's female. This is a queen who lays all the eggs and produces all the young for the colony, and she's female, and more about her in a minute. This individual on the bottom is the drone, and he's the only male, and we'll talk more about him in a second, but he basically plays almost no role in the life of the colony other than fertilizing the queen. And so they never see them. But the Greeks did figure out that there was this other colony, there was this other kind of bee because they kept bees and they could see that there was this other individual. But they noticed that the drones didn't do anything because they just hang around in the colony and are fed by the workers, but they couldn't figure out the drone's sex. And part of the confusion was that the Greeks were aware of the stinging ability of bees, but they thought it was impossible that an animal that had a weapon could be female. And similarly, on looking at the defense of the hive that was exhibited by a lot of social insects, including honeybees, a lot of Arab cultures likened the colony to an army. So that meant there was going to be a military with males as both officers and soldiers. The stinger, as you probably know, is a modified egg-laying structure. It has to be coming from a female, but the workers are generally unable to reproduce. And so it actually took until the late 1600s when a Dutch microscopist, Jan Swammerdam, is generally credited with demonstrating that the individual that was assumed to be the king actually had ovaries. And just in case you think, well, how could they have known that before? They had microscopes, and it's really not that hard to figure this out, and the anatomy of many other insects was well understood. And Swammerdam was actually supposed to have dissected a bee kind of as a public event in 1668, which I always am kind of entertained by. I don't know whether they had cocktails or not, but can you imagine like getting an ad that said that someone was going to dissect a bee, and you were going to see whether it had boy parts or girl parts? I don't know. Would you have come? I guess maybe people would come. It might be interesting. But I do always wonder if he sold tickets. In any event, he did figure out that there were these anatomical differences between males and females, and that the drones, the workers, and the queens were all different. And the next puzzle was to determine how exactly the queen produced the other types, since no one had ever seen bees engaging in sex. And Swammerdam actually came up with an idea where he suggested that you could determine whether the female bee, so there was this thing called aura seminalis, which is, the drones produce a strong odor, and if you keep bees, you notice it. And so he wondered if the odor was enough to impregnate the queen. And so he actually suggested an experiment that totally would have worked, where he said whether the female bee enclosed in a little net made of fine thread or in a small glass vessel covered with a piece of fine linen or in a box with holes in it, I mean, clearly he was really developing the methods here, could be impregnated by the bare scent of the male. And he just suggested it, but he never actually did it. And honestly, they never clarified the mating process for literally hundreds of years. Although 18th century scientists did notice that queen bee sometimes returned to her hive with the genitalia of the drone still attached to her reproductive organs. And then finally, in the mid-1900s, naturalists discovered drone swarms. And so in both bees and ants, what will happen is, and I don't have a good picture of this in bees, but I do have one in ants, but it's the same thing, where there will be groups of virgin males that fly out from the nest. And in the case of ants, that's the only time all year that they have wings. And they fly out and then they congregate in small areas. And in the case of honeybees, they're near a hive. When I was at university, at the right time of year, if you know where to look, you can find them by listening for their humming. And my college entomology professor took us out to one such site. And what he did was go out and you could hear kind of this low hum in the air, but you couldn't see anything. And he just picked up a pebble from the ground and threw it up. And then in like seconds later, and so these are ants swarming. Seconds later, what happened is that this ball of, in our case, bees, but in this case, you can see here ants, fell to the ground because all of the males immediately fly after the female, cluster around her, and she flies faster and faster. Eventually, one or more of them catch her, and then she falls to the ground. The male that actually mates with her, as was alluded earlier in a somewhat interesting graphic description. His genitalia do explode, although they don't look like that, and in the earlier picture, and then he dies, and that's all there is. I know people always laugh at that point. I mean, honestly, if you're a male honeybee and that's what happens to you, it's the best thing that could possibly happen, because the alternative to that is that you die without mating, and then it's worse because you don't leave any genes in succeeding generations. Really, it is worse. So this just gives you an idea of this is mating in a different kind of ant. These are rover ants, and again, the individual with the wings is a male, and the much, much, much larger individual is a female. So, all right, even once people kind of figured that part out about the honeybees, I think that they've had a hard time wrapping their heads around this question about sex and gender and insects. And one of the things that happens to me is that when I teach about this at university, after my lecture about the army ants, the ones I talked about earlier, you know, the fierce consumers of everything in their path, I'll always end up with at least one student who will come up afterwards and say, "So, Dr. Zuk, you know about the ants?" I said, "What about them?" Like, you said all the workers were female, but what about the army ants? Their workers are female too. Yeah, but what about the soldiers? The ones you said have those huge jaws and everything. Well, those are females too. So, really, the soldiers are female? Really, the soldiers are female, and this shows you how fierce they are. So what they use those jaws for, incidentally, is to jam into well, in this case, the photographer, and then they don't actually bite you with the jaws. They use that to stabilize themselves so they can sting you with the stinger, which is in the back end. So it's a very efficient system. But really, it is the females that do this. And at that point, usually in the conversation, the student kind of squints at me and then just kind of slouches off like I've let them down somehow. I've never figured out what it was that was the problem, but they just don't really like it. And this is what the male army ants look like. No one ever sees them. Even people who study them very rarely see them, and so forth. And I understand. Oh, and so just my point that people are always doing this in all kinds of movies and everything else. They always depict ants as being male rather than female. And there was this movie, which again some of you may have seen or your children may see. And like how hard would it be? The tagline was it's his day. Well, no, it's her day. Really, how hard would it be to get this right? And also, lest you think this is an obsession because I'm from the United States and this is an American thing, it is not. I've spent a lot of time in Australia, and I will tell you about Yamba, the honey ant. So honey ants are the ants that store honeydew in their abdomens, as you can see here, and then share it with their nest mates. And in the arid regions of Australia where they have honey ants, they have a TV show called Yamba the Honey Ant. And when I first saw a thing about it, I thought, oh, wow, because Yamba, that sounds like it could be a female name, right? It's totally like it's going to be a girl ant. So I went to actually kind of a ridiculous amount of trouble to try and see an episode of Yamba the Honey Ant, and discovered, much to my disappointment, that Yamba is actually male. And so, generations of Australian school children have clearly grown up with the same misconceptions as my own undergraduates. Now, okay, so it's clear that I have kind of a thing about this, in case you haven't figured that out already. But I think it's actually important because if we don't see the roles that males and females play in other animals, then it's kind of like we don't see all the possibilities that there are out there. And this brings me to kind of a main point, although it's coming a little bit late in the lecture, which is that I really believe, and I think I can defend, what may sound like a peculiar statement, which is that sex in insects is just really more interesting than sex in people. And I think that that's partly because, as I've already been talking about, insects are really good at breaking the rules. They change our misconceptions about sex. For one thing, sex is actually not even necessary. There are lots of insects that can reproduce, like these aphids here, without ever mating with a male. So females just give birth to females that are genetically exactly like them. This is happening in your rose garden, potentially right now. And it's just virgin birth, just right there. And insects have been doing it for a long time. But I will say, although this is a cute cartoon, in case you can't read the caption, it says, "Get a container of oatmeal, you two." I will say that it's also the case that only the adults will mate. And so what's wrong with this cartoon is not that they're suggesting that insects are having sex all the time, but that these are larvae. They're not adults, and only the adults mate. Another thing about insects that's more interesting, I think, than in people is their sperm. I mean, most of us probably don't think sperm is very interesting one way or the other. But in insects, so male insects fight with each other just like males and lots of animals fight with each other, and they'll use horns like these rhinoceros beetles do to knock each other off of branches. But they also fight with their sperm. And their sperm has evolved extraordinary structures and extraordinary capacity to do that. So there's some kinds of flies that have sperm cells that are much, much longer than their own bodies. And the amount of physiological energy they devote to sex is considerable. They also will compete, not just with those horns that you saw, but with their sperm. And when damselflies and dragonflies mate, the males use their penis kind of like a shovel, so they scoop out the sperm of the previous mate that the females had, and then replace that sperm with their own. So what all of this leads to is that, again, people often think that other animals, like the natural way for the sexes to be, is kind of like a 1950s comedy where the female is taking care of the male and the female is subservient and the male is dominant and macho, and that's kind of natural, and we have all of these modern things, but they're not really the way biology intended. But in fact, that's not at all the case. In katydids, which are relatives of crickets and grasshoppers, when they mate, the males do produce sperm, because that kind of defines males. But the males also produce this kind of globby thing along with the sperm. And so this is a pair of katydids here, and this green thing, so the white stuff is the sperm, the green thing is what's called a nuptial gift. So it's something that the male produces out of his own body that he offers to the female while they're mating. And it can weigh up to 1/3 of the male's body weight. Okay, at this point, I'm going to pause for a moment. And what we're going to imagine is that when people had sex, if every time that happened, the man had to produce something that weighed, I don't know, 10 kilos, maybe 15, I don't know how, I'm not converting this very well because I mostly think in pounds. Like a big thing, okay, a really big thing, along with the sperm every time they had sex. And the females they turn out to be nutritious, and the females eat them during and after mating. And so what that means, okay, two things, well, several things. Okay, first thing is that if the man had to do that, he probably could not do this very often, right? Because really, 30% of your body weight, it would be exhausting. And what that would mean is that the females actually gain by mating with as many males as possible, because the more males they mate with, the more of these nuptial gifts they get, and the better off they are. The males, on the other hand, since they can't produce these things very often, prefer to only mate with females who are going to lay a lot of eggs, so they get a little bit more out of their investment, as it were. And that way, they can mate relatively less often, but still sire a lot of offspring. Okay, now I realize I've said all of this. This is not to suggest that this would be a useful model for humans to emulate, but there was a little cry of disappointment I just heard in the audience. Okay, well, do what you will. Like, don't let me stop you. But the point is that it's not that insects are doing things that we should think, oh yes, this would be a great thing to do, or this would be not a great thing to do. It's that insects break all the rules. Males can be really good parents. This is a giant water bug, and it's a male, and all of those round things on his back are the eggs, and he carries them around, and then when they hatch, he takes care of the babies. So it's not like being a mother is necessarily, or being a parent is something only females can do biologically. And so in general, to me, insects, it's like they can be a window. So you can look at them and they show us completely new things that we would never have thought of before. Sometimes they can be a mirror, and they do reflect what we do ourselves. But regardless, I think that insects can show us that there's just another way to do things. And there's a way that's just as natural and normal as the way we do them ourselves. Thank you.